M72 LAW. In combat, the best weapon is the one you actually carried in. The Army tried to replace this rocket twice. The first blew up on a helicopter. The second was too heavy to carry into a building. They spent $250 million trying to fix it. They couldn't. Fallujah, 2004. Marines clearing buildings room by room, wall by wall. The Army had issued them a replacement, 15 pounds, designed to kill Soviet tanks. There were no Soviet tanks in Fallujah. There were concrete walls, fortified rooms, and doors rigged to kill the first man through. The 15-pound launcher was built for open terrain. The Marines were in a city, so they left it at the vehicle. They pulled a 45-year-old tube out of storage instead. Right now, in 2026, it is still in production, still being shipped into active war zones, still being ordered in variants its designers never imagined. And in 2021, the Pentagon signed a nearly $500 million contract to keep buying the 1958 original. To understand why the Army wanted a new rocket, you have to understand what it was replacing and why that wasn't good enough. The M20 Super Bazooka, 14 pounds unloaded, 5 feet long assembled. It took 2 men to operate, a gunner and a loader working in coordination under fire. 2 soldiers committed to a single weapon before the squad had done anything else. Setup time that burned seconds you didn't have. In the fluid, fast-moving infantry combat the Army was planning for, that was a liability the service couldn't afford. The requirement that came out of the mid-1950s was simple. 1 man, 1 rocket, no crew. A personal anti-armor capability that every soldier in the squad could carry without thinking about it and fire alone in under 5 seconds. Development started at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama in 1958. Engineers built the answer around a solid rocket motor inside a telescoping 2-piece fiberglass tube. The inner tube slid rearward to extend the weapon. That single motion deployed the sights automatically. No battery, no assembly under stress. You extended the tube and pulled the trigger. 5.5 pounds, 25 inches collapsed, 66 millimeter heat warhead. Minimum arming distance, 10 meters, about 33 feet. That last number, hold on to it. In 1963, the Army and Marine Corps adopted it. M72 light anti-tank weapon, the LAW. Every man in the squad now had a personal rocket that weighed less than a rifle and 3 magazines. What happened when it met actual combat was something else entirely. The night of February 6th into 7th, 1968, Long Vây Special Forces Camp, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam, near the Laotian border. Detachment Alpha 101, 5th Special Forces Group. Roughly 24 American Green Berets, several hundred civilian irregular defense group and Montagnard fighters, 100 M72 LAWs issued to the CIDG personnel for anti-armor defense. North Vietnamese forces hit the camp with infantry and PT-76 light amphibious tanks, Soviet-built, relatively thin armor, on the order of 10 to 20 millimeters on the hull sides. The M72's 66 millimeter heat round, rated for 300 millimeters of penetration, should have handled them on paper. More than enough capability for what they were facing. The Green Berets organized anti-tank teams and engaged. What followed is documented in U.S. Army Special Operations Forces histories with uncomfortable precision. Many of the defenders at Long Vây were unaware that the M72 had a minimum arming distance of 33 feet. In the chaos of close-in fighting, with tanks inside the wire, with PT-76s rolling through prepared positions at point-blank range, rounds were being fired at vehicles that had driven inside that distance. The fuse had not armed. The rocket hit the hull and did nothing. Other rounds misfired entirely. The Army histories are direct. A significant number of the LAWs either failed to detonate or produced no meaningful effect, enough that the tanks kept coming. The camp fell. Among the American Special Forces at Long Vây, most were killed, wounded, or captured before dawn, alongside devastating losses among the Montagnard defenders, one of the most costly nights for a Special Forces A-team in the Vietnam War. There was a separate, subsequent problem that widened the damage. Broader Vietnam-era service revealed that some M72 warheads were detonating in flight before reaching the target. Rounds that activated when they shouldn't have, in the air, short of the objective. The Army recalled and modified the inventory. Improved rounds with corrected fuse systems were issued with distinctive markings. The mechanical problem was addressed. The reputational problem was not. Soldiers who had cycled through law after law while tanks ground through their defenses did not forget. The Army's institutional memory arrived at a verdict. The M72 was the rocket that couldn't stop tanks. That verdict was not entirely wrong, but it missed something. Because as the fight continued, as tanks stalled navigating obstacles, as crews bailed from disabled vehicles, the men who still had functioning laws stopped directing them at moving hulls and started directing them at what was exposed. A round that couldn't arm against a tank at close range could still reach a crewman in an open hatch. It wasn't the kill the weapon was designed for. It was soldiers finding the usable edge inside the weapon's limitations. That adaptation didn't save the camp, but it pointed towards something the official verdict never captured. In engagement after engagement across Vietnam, not armored assaults, not Soviet-built tanks at close range, but the grinding daily contact of jungle and fortified position warfare, the weapon was performing. Fortified fighting positions that absorbed small arms fire, positions that couldn't be flanked efficiently, and that resisted rifle fire entirely. Units credited the M72 with neutralizing exactly these targets. During the Battle of Hue in 1968, urban combat through heavily built French colonial structures and temple walls, the weapon was going through masonry that stopped rifle rounds. The thing that had struggled against moving armor at close range was consistently lethal against stationary, hard structures at the ranges it was actually being used. The Army looked at that record and reached two simultaneous conclusions. First, the M72 needed to be improved against armor. Second, it needed to be replaced before those improvements became permanent. This was the institutional logic. You don't pour development money into improving a weapon you've already decided to retire. You fund the replacement and accept the limitations as a transition cost. What the requirement never fully asked was whether the replacement needed to solve for armor first or whether the actual combat environment was already telling a different story. That question went unasked. The replacement program launched instead. It would consume $250 million and a decade before the answer became unavoidable. The Army was about to spend 20 years solving for the war on the chart. The war that actually came was something different. 1972. The Army launched the formal study, Improved Light Anti-Tank Weapon, ILAW. The mandate? Replace the M72 with something better against Soviet armor. Same weight class, no significant cost increase. 1975. Request for proposals. 1976. General Dynamics selected. The program renamed. They called it the Viper. Designation FGR-17. General Dynamics projected unit cost at around $78 per round in 1970s dollars. That number was not anchored in reality. Development ran through the late 70s into the early 80s. The gap between the $78 projection and the actual cost trajectory widened sharply. In December 1981, the Army awarded a $14.4 million contract for 1,400 Viper rounds. 2 months later, February 1982, a second contract, 60,000 rounds, $83.7 million. At that point, congressional oversight caught up with what testing had already been showing. The fuse system had a problem: static electricity. Under certain conditions, the warhead could detonate shortly after launch, not on impact, in flight. One documented incident involved a pallet of Vipers damaged by static discharge on a helicopter, not in combat, not in a field exercise, but during routine transport. The same electrical environment a soldier encounters on any given day could set it off. A classified GAO report concluded the Viper barely met the low end of the Army's stated requirements. No significant superiority over the M72 LAW. Think about that. A decade of work, over $250 million, and the government's own analysis said it was marginally better than the weapon it was supposed to replace, while threatening to detonate on the operator. In September 1983, General Dynamics refused a fixed-price contract incorporating the required safety modifications. Without a contractor willing to take the risk, the Army had no path forward. All contracts canceled. Over $250 million. No replacement. The same 5.5-pound tube, still in the inventory. First Challenger down. But the Viper left something the cancellation report didn't capture. A weapon that could detonate during routine transport doesn't just fail a program, it confirms a suspicion that the more complex the replacement, the more ways it can kill you before you ever reach the enemy. The M72 was still there, 5.5 pounds, same tube. Congress stepped in after Viper and mandated a different approach entirely. No more domestic development from scratch. Evaluate existing systems, off-the-shelf, proven hardware that had already been tested and fielded somewhere in the world. Adopt the best available option and accept whatever trade-offs came with it. The alternative? Another decade and another $250 million chasing a development program that might fail was not acceptable. The Army evaluated multiple candidates. The U.S. Marine Corps separately selected the Israeli-derived B-300 design as the Mark 153 SMA. For the Army, the winner was Swedish, the AT-4, designed by Bofors and manufactured under U.S. license by Alliant Tech Systems, was adopted as the M136 light anti-tank weapon. The Army fielded it widely by the mid-1980s. Official replacement for the M72 as the primary individual light anti-armor weapon. The specifications made the case clearly. Caliber, 84 mm. Armor penetration, approximately 400 mm of rolled homogeneous armor, substantially more than the M72's 300 mm figure. Maximum effective range against armor, around 300 meters versus the M72's 200. U.S. Army data list unit replacement cost at approximately $1,480 in late 1990s figures. Better penetration, better range, comparable cost. Against the threat the Army had been planning around, Soviet armor, European terrain, armored formations advancing across open ground, the selection made sense on every metric the procurement system was measuring. There was one specification that didn't appear on that justification. U.S. Army data list the AT-4 loaded system weight at approximately 14.5 to 15 pounds. The M72 weighs 5.5. A soldier on full combat load could carry 2 M72s for the weight of a single AT-4. The AT-4 was not a weapon you clipped to your kit and forgot about. It was a deliberate weight commitment that had to be planned into every loadout, weighed against every other piece of gear that determined whether you came back from the mission. For vehicle-mounted operations, for prepared defensive positions, for mission profiles where you anticipated engaging armor at range, the AT-4 made tactical sense. For sustained, dismounted patrol operations, for rapid urban clearing, for the kind of infantry fighting where every pound matters against every other pound, it was a different calculation. In the 1980s and through the 90s, that distinction didn't generate a crisis. The Cold War threat model held. No major conflict fundamentally challenged the AT-4's weight premium against the capability it provided. The M72 was formally supplanted as the primary system. It was never formally banned or declared entirely inactive. The supply chain continued. Tubes accumulated in armories. No one ordered a wholesale disposal. But it was a legacy system, deprioritized, expected to fade. That expectation lasted until 2001. The Army had replaced a carryable weapon with a better weapon nobody wanted to carry, and the 5.5-pound tube was still in the armory. And then the war came that proved it. November 2004. Operation Phantom Fury, also known as Operation Al-Fajr, the largest American urban assault since the Battle of Hue in 1968. Roughly 12,000 U.S., Iraqi, and Allied forces moving through a city with a pre-war civilian population of approximately 250 to 300,000 people, against an insurgent force that had spent months preparing the urban grid specifically to kill the men trying to clear it. The insurgents had studied the problem carefully. They punched holes through interior walls between adjacent buildings so fighters could move between structures without ever exposing themselves to the street. They rigged entry doors with improvised explosive devices. They built murder holes, apertures cut through walls at weapon height to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every conventional approach to every position. They fortified upper floors. They created a network of interconnected fighting positions inside what looked, from the outside, like a normal city block. They did not need armor. They had concrete and time and interior lines. Marines learned very quickly that approaching a door was a reliable way to die. The standard entry points, the ones defenders expected, had been pre-sighted, pre-rigged, or pre-positioned for. The buildings themselves were the threat. Thick-walled, interconnected structures that absorbed rifle fire, protected the men inside, and gave defenders the time and mobility to reposition as clearing operations tried to advance. The tactic that worked was to bypass the doors entirely and breach through walls. Create a new entry point where no defender had positioned, where no device had been planted, where the geometry hadn't been constructed to kill the first man through. Establish the breach, push through, clear the room from an unexpected angle. To do that, you needed an explosive effect, delivered at short range by a single operator on demand in the middle of everything else the Marine was already carrying. The AT-4 could breach a concrete block wall. The question was whether you could afford to carry it. A Marine doing 12-hour rotations through house-to-house clearing in full kit had a weight budget that was already stretched before the mission started. Rifle and ammunition, water, communications gear, medical supplies, body armor, grenades. The total combat load in that environment routinely exceeded 80 pounds. Every pound allocated to a breaching weapon was a pound subtracted from something else. The AT-4 at 15 pounds was a substantial portion of the available margin. It made sense to carry it in certain mission profiles, for operations where armor contact was anticipated, for prepared assault scenarios with specific breaching requirements. It did not make sense to carry it as a secondary, on-demand breaching option alongside everything else, not in the sustained, unpredictable, physically demanding tempo of prolonged urban clearing. So Marines started leaving it. Not officially, not as a policy decision, as the individual weight calculation that every Marine made when he loaded out for a rotation. The weapon that the procurement system had certified as the M72's replacement was being left at the vehicle because the men using it had decided the trade-off wasn't worth it in the environment they were actually fighting in. The M72 was something different. 5.5 pounds, 25 inches collapsed, small enough to add to a combat load without materially affecting anything else. A weapon a Marine could carry as a second or third option without making a deliberate sacrifice somewhere else in the loadout. You slung it over your shoulder, you forgot about it during movement, and it was there when the wall was in front of you, and you needed to go through it. The weight math made the choice obvious. 2 M72s weighed 11 pounds total, 4 pounds less than a single AT-4. A Marine could carry a dedicated breaching capability and still come out ahead on weight. The AT-4 went on the vehicle for patrols where armor contact was possible. The M72 went on the Marine for everything else. That wasn't doctrine. That was the daily calculation every man with a finite weight budget makes when he loads out for a mission. And by 2004, the variants being pulled back into service weren't the original heat anti-armor weapon. The M72 A6 and A7 had been updated updated with a blast effect warhead, optimized for structures, for rooms, for the detonation pattern that cleared a space rather than penetrated armor plate. The weapon the institutional memory had condemned for failing to kill tanks was quietly rebuilt around the target it had always actually excelled against. In 2010, a post-Afghanistan lessons learned assessment attributed to the 10th Mountain Division put it plainly: the M72 provided the best balance of weight and bulk to combat effectiveness of any weapon in the inventory. The procurement system had spent 20 years telling the Army the AT-4 was the right answer. The men in the field kept reaching for the 5.5-pound tube instead. The Army never published a statement acknowledging the logic of what had happened. No formal review concluded that the weight trade-off had been miscalculated. No official document described the return of the M72 as a correction to a procurement error. What happened instead was the weapon was rebuilt into what the combat environment had always required it to be. The British Army adopted an anti-structure variant, a penetrating delay fuse designed to pass through a masonry wall before detonating inside, not on impact against the exterior, through the wall, then inside the room. They fielded it as an urgent operational requirement for Afghanistan, which is a procurement category that exists specifically for capabilities the system identified too late. The name they gave it? Light Anti-Structures Missile. Not anti-tank, not anti-armor, anti-structure. The weapon introduced in 1963 as a tank killer had been formally redesignated around the target it had always actually been best against. Fire from enclosure variants addressed a constraint that had existed since the original design. The original launcher's backblast made enclosed firing dangerous enough that doctrine never properly solved it, until a dedicated fire from enclosure variant finally did. In December 2021, the Department of Defense awarded NAMO Defense Systems a firm fixed-price production contract, value $498 million. Full-rate production of M72 variants. Current production at 2 facilities, Nammo Raufoss in Raufoss, Norway, where production has run since 1966, and Nammo Tally in Mesa, Arizona. Consider what those numbers represent together. Over $250 million burned on a replacement that detonated from static electricity. A subsequent replacement adopted because it outperformed the M72 against Soviet armor. 2 decades of watching that replacement prove insufficient in the environment soldiers actually fought in, and a nearly $500 million production contract signed in 2021 for the weapon the Army had spent a generation trying to retire. No press release described any of this as an admission. The contract numbers did. In March 2022, Canada announced it would supply up to 4,500 M72 rocket launchers to Ukraine. Norway donated up to 2,000 from National Reserve stocks. The weapon the Army declared obsolete against Soviet armor in the 1980s is now being fired at Russian-built armor in eastern Ukraine. The same 1958 design, against the same country the Army originally built it to stop. The factories in Raufoss and Mesa have been building these rockets for decades. The U.S. Army is still buying them. There is a category of weapon that procurement systems always want to replace. Too simple, too cheap, too light. Too limited against the specific threat the current assessment says to prepare for. And then a war starts, and the men who have to fight it reach for the thing that fits the situation they're actually in. The Army spent over $250 million on a replacement that detonated from static electricity. It spent the next 2 decades issuing a weapon too heavy to carry on the patrols that defined the actual war. And in 2004, the men being asked to breach room by room answered the procurement system's 20-year argument not with a report, but by pulling a 60-year-old tube out of a storage room and putting it on their kit instead. The factories are still running. Nobody has found a better answer to the question the engineers asked in 1958. How do you give every soldier a rocket he can actually carry? If this made you want to go deeper, the 2 books that shaped this video are linked in the description, and so is the vault, where I keep the full script, research, and everything that didn't make the final cut. Subscribe for more.